A good friend of mine, a media psychologist, says, look, Fred, people are just nasty monkeys. I think that's fair. I think that's really fair. And if you give a nasty monkey a microphone, he's going to screech into it. And we're doing that now at scale.
Welcome to another episode of CAPTivated, a new podcast hosted by the Center for American Political History, Media, and Technology at Purdue University. In each episode, we will examine a specific facet of our digital public sphere, how it works, and how we got here. We are here to help you sort through the noise. I'm Julius.
I'm Hanna.
And I'm Sage. In this episode, we were very lucky to have Fred Turner with us. Fred was once a journalist. Today, he's a professor of communication, a professor of history, and a professor of art history at Stanford University, where he teaches, researches, and writes about media and technology.
He's written 5 books and dozens of articles. And Fred is someone who often finds himself on the outside of cool things, looking in.
He went to Burning Man, but he was the guy in a button-down interviewing the nudists and the go-go dancers. Fred focuses on how culture and ideology shapes technological change.
On this podcast, we're thinking about different facets of the digital public sphere. And I don't know how I can communicate this adequately. I have been bombarded with negative feedback about how I say the word sphere, because I believe that Americans just say it that way.
It's not Americans,
No,
Julius. It's just you.
Well, I will be the one person on earth that says sphere. But for the piece of this podcast today, I will say sphere. Is that helpful?
Thank you, Julius.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. Fred took us back to really think about that concept of a public sphere. It's a term that often gets thrown around, but for those who might not be familiar, it's really worth explaining its origins that come from a German philosopher and social theorist. And Hannah, I'm going to butcher his name if you don't help me. How do I say it?
Jürgen Habermas. And so what Habermas calls the bourgeois public sphere is the imaginary space where people come together to question public authorities.
It started out as actual spaces like coffee houses and literary salons in the 17th and 18th century, where people would debate and gossip, and those discussions then moved to print in magazines and newspapers later on. This debating public was a counterpoint to the power of the old nobility and the church.
However, Fred points out this ideal Habermasian version of deliberation that it no longer holds in today's digital public sphere. The personalization and the attention economy have corrupted that and tampered with people's ability to hold fruitful conversations.
And I thought it was quite fascinating when he traced back the digital public sphere we have today to a group of scientists after World War II. And these scientists were afraid of mass media because they felt like mass media brought us fascism and Hitler, and therefore they promoted this alternative media model where every individual could be their own information producer.
This conversation with Fred really made me think about how important regulations are. He's got this great analogy about forcing car manufacturers to incorporate seatbelts. So let's get this show on the road. We start by asking Fred about his background.
So I used to be a journalist right out of college. My first intellectual affection was the American Puritans. I really loved early American literature. But when I went to grad school the first time for about a minute and saw what it would be like to be a scholar of early American literature, I bailed. I ran away to Berlin, and in Berlin, I became kind of a punk ESL teacher, did that for a while, and I started writing about bands that were playing in Berlin for an English language magazine there, and I realized, oh, wait a minute, I really like being a journalist. So when I came back to the States, I did that for 10 years in Boston, mostly cultural reporting. Toward the end of that time, I realized that I was writing really fast and not about things that I really cared about, which were much slower, deeper kinds of phenomena. And I wrote a book about how Americans remember the Vietnam War. And by the time I was done with that, I was writing books with footnotes, teaching part-time. I realized, oh, wait a minute, I'm becoming a professor. So I moved to California for graduate school, UC San Diego. And when I got there in 1996, this thing called the internet was hitting. And there was Wired magazine. And Wired magazine had this sort of psychedelic cover, and there were all these ex-hippies promoting computers. And I'm like, wait a minute, I just wrote this Vietnam book. And in the Vietnam book, the computer was the emblem of the Cold War American state. And now here were these hippies promoting computers as tools of liberation, and Steve Jobs advertising the Mac as this liberating anti-Orwell machine. And I got kind of baffled. And so I just started rummaging through the magazine and ended up finding these hippies who were really working in the tech industry. And I wrote a book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. And after that, I've stayed tight with tech and culture.
Amazing. So you found your way to the button down.
No, the button down was by birth. Thank you very much. No, so I am the child of a political scientist and an anthropologist. So I come by this by breeding. Yeah, no. My dad used to take me to men's shops and teach me how to dress. And I still rock a good Brooks Brothers button down. Yeah. Thanks. And I rocked one on the playa at Burning Man. Yes, and that is a true story.
Amazing. Well, we definitely are going to want to hear more about Burning Man. But before we get to that, I think the question that we wanted to ask you is, what do you see as being the biggest problem with the digital public sphere today?
Yeah. The public sphere that I was always told was the ideal, and that I still in some ways think is the Habermasian public sphere, where we gather together in some place and we reason together about the public good. We tend to do it in person. We do it in small groups. And out of our deliberations comes something called public opinion, which the government then acts on through our representatives. That's an ideal public opinion. But it depends on people being able to suppress parts of themselves so that they can reason together. They have to suppress their appetites, their desires, their hidden personal things, their peculiarities, their kinks. All those things have to stay off-site in the Habermasian model. In internet land and internet times, we are constantly encouraged to personalize our discourse, to seek attention by taking parts of ourselves that were formerly offstage, private, quite possibly irrational, and performing those. I feel that incentive every time I log on. I watch my daughter fill out her Instagram and keep it stocked with images. And she is clearly having she's having the Instagram system, and her friends through the system are soliciting her performance of a kind of individuality. That's fine in that private space. But when you shift to debating the distribution of public goods on terms that are deeply personal, it becomes impossible to have a rational debate. Because what's at stake now is who you are as a person. It's no longer, how should we equitably distribute those resources? It's, I'm this kind of person, you're that kind of person, you shouldn't have anything. All right, so I think personalization is the biggest problem. Right behind it is individuation. I think our media system, we hoped that by individuating communication systems, by giving everyone a mouthpiece, we would end up in what Marshall McLuhan called sort of global village, a place where we would all communally, collaboratively make nice with each other. Well, people aren't built like that. A good friend of mine, a media psychologist, says, look, Fred, people are just nasty monkeys. I think that's fair. I think that's really fair. And you give a nasty monkey a microphone, he's going to screech into it. And we're doing that now at scale. So I think that far from bringing us global village, the individuation of communication technologies has instead resulted in a war of all against all. Last thought, it's not just individuation, it's centralized individuation. So the internet is not a conversation system, although it's sold to us that way. The internet is a system of global micro-broadcasting. We all broadcast all the time, but our broadcasts now are coordinated, centralized, platformed by firms that have an interest in our producing certain kinds of attention-grabbing material. That combination of our need to broadcast, the individuation of that process, and the platform's need to profit from our interactions produces an incredibly toxic stew. So it's personalization, individualization, and commercial platforming.
Okay, well, that begs the question is, how did we get there?
Oh, yeah. So that's a long story, but I'll tell a short version of it. You might think that we only get there after the rise of social media in the 2010s. That's an important inflection point. But the dream of a global conversation system facilitated by digital media is about 70 years old. And it really emerges right after World War II among a group of scientists and social scientists who call themselves cyberneticists. And they dream of a world where everything is information, where the material world is secondary and order is produced by signaling. They're very afraid of mass media. In their view, mass media is what brought us fascism. Hitler got hold of the radio, Hitler got hold of the movies. One-to-many communication turned everyone into a mass of like-minded fascists. So in the American model, the cybernetic model, everyone is their own information producer. We're constantly signaling to one another. And in their theory, order should simply emerge. All right, there's a few big problems with this idea. This idea comes down to us through the 60s, comes down to us through the media world, informs a lot of early internet design, but it's got some problems. First problem is that individuals don't live in the world alone. They live in institutions. And the cybernetic model only imagines that we are all just equally free individuals signaling one another. It's just not the case. So institutions aren't part of the model. Second thing that's not part of the model is the control of engineers of the system. So the fantasy that we will all just speak into the air signaling one another by having access to new technologies, forgets the fact that certain engineers build the technologies, distribute the technologies, manage the technologies. So we're going to have platforms of some kind. And that's something that they just never talked about. So the world we've inhabited has this fantasy of kind of global egalitarian communication and emergent order, but it has a fact of commercial institutions and engineering actors who seek political control. And that's where we live right now. When you see in Washington, when you see Musk and others and Palantir collaborating with the state, what you're seeing is a fusion of the engineering world, the state world, and commercial platforms in a kind of authoritarian manner. And those are all things that the cybernetic vision left out of the picture.
Super interesting. So I think there's a thread underneath there of this idea of techno-utopianism.
Mm-hmm.
I think you go to Silicon Valley, and I know, Hannah, you've spent some time living in Silicon Valley, but there's this idea that technology in and of itself is the thing that's going to change things. Like the people working on these things, producing the technology, getting us towards this system in and of itself is going to do something. That it makes me think of the very famous Edward Murrow quote from 1958 about everyone thinking that television is going to be this instrument of enlightenment. And he, in 1958, says, actually, without what humans do with it, TV is just lights in a box. I think like even back then you had people pushing against this, I guess the word is technological determinism. Where does that techno-utopianism come from?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there was in the 1960s an embrace of the kind of cybernetic dreams of the 40s and 50s, but it turned them in a different direction. The fantasy in the 1960s among people who headed back to communes and built communal world, they dreamed of a world without politics. They thought politics was bankrupt. They'd taken us to the Vietnam War and wanted nothing to do with traditional politics. So what would replace that? Well, technology-driven consciousness would replace that. So if we could only leave politics behind, take technologies from the mainstream world, repurpose them, and turn them into technologies through which we could unite ourselves in a shared consciousness, we would find a different kind of politics, a politics like the cybernetic dream in which order emerged from our constant giving of one another feedback. So what were those technologies? Well, the commune movement was huge, and when they went back to the land, they took a lot of LSD with them. They took a lot of books with them. They were technologies of mind. Music was another one. With respect, you're too young to remember when walls of amplifiers were suddenly at concerts. And the first time you go to a concert, like not Woodstock necessarily, but something like that, and you stand next to an amplified wall of sound, and you feel the vibrations run through your body, you get a glimpse of the kind of polity that these folks wanted to create. A magic kind of polity in which vibrations, consciousness could serve as the organizing force. The world could be like Woodstock. The world could be like a commune. We would no longer need top-down hierarchical politics. All of those ideas turn out, when put into practice, to liberate some of the worst parts of being human. When you actually build a world like that, that's not just a temporary concert, but let it go for a long time, what you find is that without institutions, stereotypes take over, pernicious cultural norms take over. In the communes I looked at, charismatic men took over, and women and people of color got pushed to the side, pushed to the bottom. So one of the reasons I've become such a raging advocate for institutions is that institutions, I would argue, and bureaucracy are what keep those things at bay. They're what make possible a kind of structured intimacy across great differences that the kind of communal model really doesn't. And the communal model did travel straight to Silicon Valley. I didn't mean to ignore that, but yeah.
I was thinking a couple of things. I was thinking about the Pareto principles, the 80-20 principle. It exists both in the natural world. So apparently 20% of the pea shells produce 80% of the peas. In social settings, 20% of the people in the room do 80% of the talking. and so thinking that, somehow order would emerge naturally through just everybody having a voice, actually that did not at all happen. And people studying communications online show that these hierarchies and inequalities that already exist in society just got amplified. So that was one thought. But
can I pause on that for thought?
Yes.
So I think we should blame ourselves a little bit. In the 1990s, an awful lot of media theorists bought deeply into the utopian vision. So they would argue, Yochai Benkler, who's a very well-known scholar and a very thoughtful scholar, wrote a book about commons-based peer production, arguing that, in fact, we would suddenly now be able to manufacture things together online, collaborating as peers, and that institutions would no longer be quite so necessary. Lawrence Lessig at Harvard famously wrote about digital environments in which egalitarianism would become possible. People who studied online communities would focus on the online interactions as if now a new world were actually aborning. So I just want to flag those of us who were working on these issues in the 90s as utopians. And I think one of the challenges for us as scholars is to maintain enough distance from the money and the power in the valley, some of which can be siphoned off to us, to actually call nonsense when we see it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So that then I'm thinking about, so you say that institutions is the solution. How do you create institutions that solve the problems that we are in today, which is, these big platforms are basically dominating our digital public sphere. Now the AI companies are getting in there. There's a race to develop the best AI. U.S., China, and so on. We can't even stop to think, how do we even know how to do this in a safe manner? Now, how do you create an institution that, when we have these business incentives, that can counter that?
I have good news. So the first thing we need to say is that we're leaving behind the era of internet connectionism. In the 1990s, the tech world was focused on building global systems of interconnection. Those systems are largely built now. We're entering a new era in which data is being assembled in extraordinary quantities, and we are learning to extract it. We've left a connectionist era and we've entered an extractionist era. So AI, cyber currency, cryptocurrency, social media, those are all systems of mapping and extracting resources from the social world and increasingly the natural world. You need a lot of energy, you need a lot of water, you need a lot of cool air to make these large server farms work. Okay. Good news is that these industries are a lot like the oil companies were in the 1920s. And like the oil companies, we can regulate them. We learned to break up the oil conglomerates years ago as they were polluting our landscape. There are still oil companies, absolutely. They are still polluting, absolutely. But we had then and we have now government institutions that are capable of holding those people to account and taking action. We have to find the willpower to do that. We have to elect representatives who are not corrupted by money themselves. But those are all fights. They're going to be ongoing fights. Institutions aren't magic, but they are a vehicle for breaking up organizations like companies that would otherwise destroy public goods. And I think you can see the potential power of institutions in the degree to which tech firms are afraid of them. When you see tech firms constantly saying, AI is the future, it's just intelligence, you need to get out of our way so that we can just build it as fast as possible. What you're hearing is, don't regulate me, don't break up my profit source, don't make me stop polluting. They are afraid of the state. They are afraid of government. That's one of the reasons they're constantly trying to manage them. Their fear is a measure of our power. We have real power. To the extent that we believe that AI is somehow inevitable, that server farms are somehow required for human flourishing, we become victims of their marketing campaign. We still have institutions that have done it, and we've done it before. We have a labor movement in this country that succeeded in changing the workday. We have a state apparatus in the U.S. that has succeeded in controlling other companies. I talk about the car industry a lot. People will say to me, oh, Fred, that's terrible. Look at cars. Cars are everywhere. Well, yeah, but how about seatbelts? We legislated seatbelts. And because we managed to require seatbelts, which car companies were very reluctant to put in, we've been able to save a lot of lives. We can build some seatbelts here.
Yes, but we also have the collective action problem of, everybody wanting to get to AGI first. And so, there are people like Tristan Harris that are trying to build a public opinion saying that, hey, enough is enough, and now we need to sit down and make sure that we can at least put some red lines around the development of AGI. But it seems like a heavy lift.
Yeah, I think the challenge is to shift our attention. So long as we think the goal or even the discussion should be centered around AGI, general intelligence, the idea of a human-like intelligence, that's what we're building, we are going to be going off the rails because that's a very specifically non-specific way to think. When people in the 90s used to say, we just have to build the internet so we can all connect. And connecting was a thing, but without ever specifying what connection actually might be like. General intelligence, no specification of what that actually is. And the no specification is strategic. As long as you don't have to specify, you can use it as a reason to do anything. I would go a very different way. I would say develop AI, but develop AI in particular local contexts where it's shown to be effective. General intelligence is a fantasy, but AI can be very good at pharmaceutical development. It's very good at solving certain kinds of computational problems and writing certain kinds of computational code. And so I would flip it upside down and say, where are places in our institutions, in our lives, where we might want to apply new technologies, develop new technologies in accord with the mission of those places? I think we also need to remember that the U.S. is out front, but we're by no means alone in this process. I've just come back from France, and I attended a conference of mostly civic leaders, about 2,000 of them, all focused on trying to figure out how to use some of the new technologies within the context of the civic missions that their institutions served. That's an entirely different way to work. Other countries do work in that way. We can learn from them if we can just put our hubris to the side for a minute.
So a lot of what you're talking about is kind of engaging a lot more critically with the tech industry.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I think you've spoken about before in other places that I'm really interested in is what role does the press play in the way that we think about the tech industry, and particularly about the leaders of the tech industry, the tech bros? How do you think reporting feeds into?
Well, unfortunately, the press often help us not think, and it's been a real problem. I used to be a journalist I was a journalist for 10 years, and I still love journalism. A lot of journalism on the tech world has focused on telling heroic narratives of innovation, which of course is exactly what the tech world would like us to do. And that's a real problem. I'll give you a very concrete example. I did a book a few years ago called Seeing Silicon Valley, which was a collection of photographic portraits of working class folks in Silicon Valley with some essays by me. And photographer Mary Beth Meehan, we worked on it together, and we couldn't sell that book in the U.S.
Really?
No, I had an agent. I have a track record. I can publish books. My books sell. Nope, no interest. They said, that's just not Silicon Valley. Where's Mark Zuckerberg? Where's Elon Musk? And they weren't in our book. And the whole point of our book was to see the Silicon Valley that the myth obscures. And so that book couldn't come out until the French published it. They published it first. And 2 years later, an American publisher said, well, actually, that looks like a pretty good book, and we'll buy it, but we won't give you any money, and we don't think it'll sell. It's a bestseller right off the bat. And it sold out all of its copies right off the bat. And the publisher was like, oh, okay. And I said, can we get some more? It'll take a few months, whatever. My point being, the Silicon Valley that we have is very different than the Silicon Valley we see in the press. And the press, for the same reasons that many academics do, has an incentive to sort of stay a little bit aligned with the industries. The industries provide the news. The industries provide the stories. The market's incredibly competitive. Things move very, very fast. Critique takes time. Critique takes inside sourcing. Critique doesn't produce money. You don't get a lot of money for producing critique. You do get money and audience share for saying, wow, look at the brand new thing. Oh my God, there's a giant superhuman being coming down the pike. It's called AI, AGI. It's going to eat us alive. Oh my God. Yeah. So unfortunately, a lot of the press is doing that. There are exceptions. I want to single out particularly smaller scale writers. Wired magazine has been doing really well lately. They've been very aggressively critical. So have the Condé Nast publications, surprisingly, or is just killing it right now in reporting. Teen Vogue.
I have
Teen
heard
Vogue
that.
is just killing it.
Which is no longer a print publication.
Is that right? I did not know that part.
Teen
Yeah, I don't
Vogue
read
does
Teen
not-
Vogue, but yeah.
Teen Vogue doesn't print a magazine anymore. They've moved completely online,
But
have completely evolved and innovated with that shift.
yeah, no, and they're wonderful. And there are a number of individual actors who have, newsletters and podcasts and Substacks that are reporting on this. But by and large, the mainstream press has followed the lead of the mainstream firms, and that's unfortunate.
So I also want to go back to your original problem with the public sphere now,
Great.
to use that phrase from Habermas, and thinking about the personalization of this public sphere. What are the other problems you see with that? I know you think a lot about performance in your work. Do you think as individuals, this personalization affects how people are thinking about their identities?
Yeah. So you'll know, and others might not, that I'm deep in a book project on the 70s and 80s and on the New York art world and queer politics in that period and on the rise of performance-centered public life. And I think it's a real quandary. I look at that period and I think it's the most amazing period. It's a period in which suddenly it becomes possible to celebrate a full array of identities, a full array of particularly sexual identities, sexual preferences. And it becomes possible to take what is most personal and hidden and in some cases illegal if you're a gay man and bring it onto the public stage and say, I'm here, I'm queer, get used to it. And that's an enormously powerful public thing to do. At the same time, when you bring your most intimate self to the public sphere and you perform it in media, you reset the terms of public debate so that now you're debating about your most personal things. And other people have their own feelings about that, and they may be very different than yours. And suddenly you're in a fight about sexuality that maybe needs to be a fight about pharmaceuticals and resource management and medicine. And that's a real challenge. That's the challenge I've kind of got my finger on. These very liberating discourses, very liberating practices have opened the door to modes of debate that are themselves, I think, a problem, that make it harder to do some of the work of democracy, the heavy lifting of sharing resources across differences. Did I answer your question?
That was a perfect answer.
Oh, phew. Thank goodness. Okay.
I was sort of wondering when I was listening to the seminar we were just in, you talked about your book project. I was wondering how what you learned going back to this time in New York, how can that help us interpret the current time of, the backlash against identity politics and DEI and so on? Have any thoughts?
I have some thoughts. Yeah. I think one of the things to understand, and this is something I go into much greater length in the book, and we'll have to do kind of quick and dirty here. I think that in many ways, the language of gender flexibility, the language of performance, the language of performative identity in the 1990s became a language for class. It became a way to articulate a kind of upper class flexibility, mobility, and ability to choose that people from other classes may or may not have had. Now, it's a very sweeping statement, and it's much more sweeping than the nuanced reality on the ground. So I want to be clear that I know the reality on the ground was a little bit different. But I've always been struck that when the right pushes back on queer people so aggressively, part of what they're pushing back on is their own fears that the kind of class that many of them come from no longer matters, no longer counts. The industrial world or the agricultural worlds where they make their livings no longer matter. That where power now lives is in a constant sphere of image circulation, a constant sphere of performance. And that world, as right-wingers said in the 80s and 90s, is a space already always owned by cultural elites, many of whom are doing the kind of gender work that I'm chronicling in the book.
Well, that's really interesting, and it makes me think of, so after Trump got elected the first time, I was a journalist at the time, and I did a story on the alt-right. And so I was interviewing all these people who were part of the movement, including Richard Spencer, one of the forefront, for 3 hours. What I really got the sense of was that these people were really worried about when whites were not going to be a majority anymore. This was a real worry. And when I thought about it, yeah, that sort of makes sense because we've been treating minorities terribly all this time. And now suddenly they're going to be in majority. No wonder people are worried about that. Anyways, I don't know how this connects
I think
that.
that's critical. Yeah. And I think that there's a second strand here. So what we're talking about here is a ball of string, and there are many strings in the ball. American racism is absolutely one of the strings. I recently published an essay called The Texan Ideology, which is focused on the move of a series of Silicon Valley leaders to Texas to build out the kinds of large-scale server farms that AI and other industries require. And as they move there, they're moving to a state where extractionist visions have been around for hundreds of years. And one of the key resources that you extract things from in Texas is black people. Texas was a slave state. It was a slave state until the very end. Juneteenth is a holiday that comes from celebrating the liberation of black folks finally in Texas, much later than other states. And the eastern part of Texas was cotton country. It was farmed by slaves, and the owners of the cotton country had their power by manipulating the state to control the land, get the cotton, but also by managing slaves, enslaved people. And when they managed enslaved people, they did it in part through the ideological trick of saying, we're better, we're special, we're chosen, those folks are less than fully human. And we see those discourses coming back now as well in the tech world. Elon Musk calls for the production of more smart babies, smart being in part code for white. I go to dinners in Silicon Valley where people will talk explicitly, openly, and favorably about eugenics.
That's so scary.
It's astonishing.
Yeah.
It just astonishes me. I have to wonder, did someone not teach them about the rise of fascism? But no.
I think that this gets to your idea of that you referenced earlier about the nasty monkeys idea of that this cycle just plays itself out no matter the technology that we develop over time. These lasting ideas, these lasting concepts keep coming back and rearing their ugly heads over and over again. Of whether it's eugenics, whether it's racism, whether it's sexism, they just take new forms as the media continues to evolve.
I think that's partly right. I have a slightly different take on it. When I was a journalist, one of the things that I saw, especially because I started as a business reporter, I saw people struggling for advantage in the world. It was really, people were hustling hard. And what I see with the discourses that you just named is that those are resource pools for people who want to seek advantage. Is if as a white man I can claim that people who are not looking like me are lesser, then I instantly gain advantage. And that's very powerful. And I've actually felt that. So I'm very tall, I'm very square, I'm very old. And I walk into a room sometimes and I can tell people just like, oh, he must have something going on. He looks like the type who would have something interesting to say. And I find that fascinating. It's like I get a 10% boost just from looking like this. And I'm very aware of that. And I have family members who don't look like that and they don't get that boost. And I'm aware of that too. And so it's an advantage seeking. I think about culture and cultural resources, as things that can be pulled up when people need them. And in the case of the tech workers and eugenics, not tech workers, tech leaders in eugenics, one of the things that I think is happening there is that, yes, they're seeking advantage. Yes, they're seeking profit in the ways that I just described, and that's raced. It's heavily raced. But in addition to that, they work in firms where numbers are everything. And when they see in their imagination that some kinds of people in our society seem to be, quote, underperforming, they don't see the legacy of racism. They assign some nature to that thing. Oh, well, disproportionate people of black people are poor. Well, that must be on them somehow. The numbers say it. And there's that weird move where the number becomes the story, but it precisely obscures the whole history. But I think these are folks with faith in numbers. And from there, it's a hop, skip, and a jump to eugenics, and it's a dark stuff. But you're right; these are persistent ideologies that are just lying around for people to pick up, invigorate, and take to the bank, or in the Trump's case, take to the White House.
And so it kind of leads us to the question: we have all these problems that we've discussed so far. So, based on your work, what do you think are some solutions that, as people who are trying to learn how to become more critical media consumers, what should we be doing?
I think there's a lot of good news on that front. I think the first thing we have to do is recognize the situation that we're in. And we're in a time here in this country where we are under authoritarian assault. We have a leader and a party, a Republican Party, that I would argue are following a fascist playbook straight out of the mid-century. And we have to recognize that is the situation that we're in, and we have to push back on that. So let's just start there. There's a number of things we can do. One of the things we can do, first and foremost, is hold our political leaders to account. We still have political institutions in a way that other countries that have gone full authoritarian don't. We can push on those things. So we can not just vote, but we can lobby. We can build institutions. We can march in the street. Marching's enormously powerful. There's a wonderful book called Fighting Tyranny. It was written in the 80s, and it's a book that was used by people in Eastern Europe to resist the Soviet occupation. And what it argues, and I'll just repeat it, is persistent nonviolent resistance works. It takes time, but it works. So that's marching in the street. That's not throwing rocks at ICE, but surrounding them. That's building solidarity with people in your office so that when someone comes and asks you to do something, you don't feel like you have to just obey right away because nobody else is not everybody else is obeying. Well, if you actually talk about that, build some solidarity, you don't have to do that. You don't have to anticipatorily obey. And it's about building alternative institutions. So at Stanford, we have a faculty union for the first time, AAUP. Now, there are 2,000 faculty at Stanford and only 200 belong to the union, but the 200 of us are pretty darn serious, and we can do stuff. So I think that's the answer. Build solidarity, persist, be visible, take chances, but take chances with other people. In Silicon Valley where I live, we had a 7-mile street lined with people protesting Trump. 7 miles of people. I loved that. That really cheered me up. And just seeing my neighbors out there, I wouldn't have known my neighbors felt that way. Nobody else was flying rainbow flags. And so I didn't know. And then there we were on the street, and we recognized each other. We saw each other. And we realized, actually, we stand for democracy. That kind of work over and over again. And be prepared for the long haul. It's not quick. One last thing I will say is that online communication can help with that process, but do not mistake being vocal and visible online for taking action. It's not the same thing. It's super important to organize together in person, institutionally, slowly, building trust with one another, because the pushback when it comes will come in the form of ICE troops with masks and guns. And you got to be ready for that. And no Facebook presence is going to prepare you for that.
And so I hear everything you're saying, and what I'm starting to think about is a lot of those things are somewhat coded, and you can tell me if you disagree, coded liberally or the more democratic
definitely.
side. So what do we do with individuals who may be listening who don't see Trump as this fascist force, but still want to understand how to kind of push back against some of this media and this technology that is kind of consuming our world.
Right. Let's start with folks who might support Donald Trump. And there are actually things that Donald Trump believes that I also believe. And I think that's a great place to start. Like, let's start by talking to each other about the questions that we share and the issues that we share. I think the question about what to do with America's borders is a real question. We ought to be all talking about that together. So let me just say that. A couple of things we can do in the short term. The first thing we can do is monitor our media diet. Make sure we're finding reputable sources. And what's a reputable source? Well, it's a source that checks facts and believes in facts. I subscribe to 8 newspapers. I get them every day. And they're places like the Times or the Post or the Wall Street Journal, mainstream, but they check their facts. Okay, so that's one thing. Second thing you can do is make a special point of talking to people whose views are different than your own in an open-minded way. Do that repeatedly, and gradually you'll find yourself becoming more flexible. Your core beliefs might not change, but you'll at least have a gut check. I think those are 2 good things. I got 2 good things.
No, absolutely. No, I think
That's great.
that's an important point. I think that it is just hard, especially when you think about how some of these things are being impacted by the current administration, to not have that coded part to it. But I think that it's important that everyone understand that we all play a role in this, that there's a way that we can all participate in kind of not allowing the Silicon Valley hegemony to take over our lives the way that it wants to. And so helping everyone understand that we all are affected by that is really important.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think the first thing you can do, too, is you just turn off your machines. I turn off my cell phone. I don't go to bed with my cell phone. My cell phone is shut down. My wife goes to bed with her cell phone. That's a problem. But I don't.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to ask you about in thinking about some ways to navigate your own personal technology. Like, what advice or what things do you think people should be thinking about as they move through their day with their laptop, iPad, phone?
It's a great question. I found that so I'm I'm 64. I was born before technologies were everywhere, right? So I was born when we had 3 TV stations and 2 of them came in fuzzy. In that world, I never had to think about this. But as new media technologies have come along, and especially once I got a cell phone, I found that I had to make a point of getting time away from my machines. So I meditate every morning. I take some time a couple times a day to make sure that I go for a walk somewhere where my machines are not. I turn off my cell phone. I leave it in the office when I go for a walk so that I get some embodied time in the physical world. I make time. My family now lives on the East Coast, but when I'm seeing them, I very much shut everything else down so I can see them. And with my friends, the same way. So creating media-free spaces in which you can be wholly present to what's happening right around you, I think that's key.
The first thing that actually makes me think of is something that I've noticed in the US, which we absolutely do not have in the UK, which is TVs in every single bar and restaurant. I find it a really
insane,
interesting thing that happens in the States, that any bar and restaurant you go to, anywhere you sit, you're in sightline of at least 4 or 5 televisions. And it's impossible to have an engaged, fully present conversation with someone when there's a screen in your peripheral vision that's moving. You just can't.
You just can't. And Steve Bannon has talked about flooding the zone with things. And what those TVs do is they flood the zone with commercial propaganda. My old advisor, Michael Schudson, called that stuff capitalist realism. It's like socialist realism. They're like posters, but they're alive. They're on the walls. They're talking at you all the time. And it's almost impossible to form a solidarity, a coalition of 5 or 6 people at dinner who can talk things through carefully and build trust in one another while the Dallas Cowboys are blaring down at you from overhead.
It's always the Dallas Cowboys.
It is, isn't it, though? What's up with that? I have to ask, is that a race thing, too? Because it's the Dallas Cowboys.
Definitely with Jerry Jones. It's definitely a race thing.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, yeah.
But I really thought about this because I grew up in Sweden, and at our family dinners or gatherings, we would never have a TV on, ever, right? And here, at all the family gatherings, there's always the bloody TV on. And I can't, and I feel...
Well, you can come to my house. I'm happy to report there will not be TV on at my house.
I don't even understand it myself. Now that you guys are bringing it up, I don't really think about it. It's just like, I guess we just like refuse to not be entertained at all times. It's like there's like this always a desire to escape the natural process of human interaction of like, if a conversation becomes awkward, at least the Dallas Cowboys are on in the background and I can turn to the game, or like at least I have my phone and I can go on Instagram if this date isn't going well. Like all these options to escape the human experience. But aside from the point, but it's interesting for sure.
Oh, that's so dark. I mean, because, it's like if you're escaping the human experience, then you're not having the human experience. And it becomes almost impossible to build solidarity with other humans, to gut check, to fact check, to do all the things that we need to do to build a society in which we govern ourselves and don't submit to authoritarian, charismatic leaders.
Right, because you don't really have people's attention because it's half split.
Right, and splitting people's attention is so. I mean, what would you want to do if you wanted to build an authoritarian society? What would you want to do? Well, you would want to fracture solidarity between people. You would want to turn groups against one another, and you would want to take up half the mind space of every thinking individual. And you would also, of course, want to destroy the sciences, destroy journalism, destroy the organs that might tell a different story, so that you could control the story space, and the story space itself would consist of audiences that were hyper-individuated, unable to talk with each other, and unable to push back in a collective way.
And you start to take the people's economic power. I think part of this conversation with AI is that that there's an attempt to replace people, but also draw people more into media. So it's like pull us away from each other in terms of our interactions with each other, draw us deeper into interacting with AI and treating it like it's our therapist, treating it's like our friend, while it's also actively replacing people in their jobs.
Yeah.
Amazon is replacing people. Walmart is replacing people with AI. And so it's like you take their economic power, you take their social power, like all they have left is to hate each other or whoever you gave them as the boogeyman. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and I hate to say it, but this is the logic of the slaveholder. What would you want from an enslaved person? Well, what you want to do is you want to break their ties to the rest of their world. You want to literally own every part of their social life, every part of their social world. You want them on your plantation. In many ways, what Facebook wants is us on their plantation. I don't necessarily need to have my body there, and I'm not arguing that they're going to whip me if I do something wrong. However, they absolutely want to capture every part of my social world and turn that into a resource for themselves. They are turning my life into labor for them, just as slaveholders in the old days turned the lives of enslaved Americans into wealth for themselves.
This is making me think of a really great essay by Bell Hooks called The Oppositional Gaze. And she mentions in The Oppositional Gaze, she talks about under slavery sort of moment of, to use James Scott's terms, infrapolitics, looking where you're not supposed to look.
Right.
Having like that be a form of looking at someone you're not supposed to look at, for example, like the slave master's wife or something like that, but also not the thing I'm thinking of in terms of this conversation is paying attention to something that you're not supposed to be paying attention to because your attention is actually the thing that's important. And that's, if you think about the politics of attention and how that works in this extractive economy that you've been talking about in the tech world, I think is really interesting. And I suppose I had never really thought about it in terms of these companies are farming your attention, but in doing that, what are they taking your attention away from?
That's right. That's why Stuart Hall has this wonderful, wonderful term. It's a little awkward, but I love it, called exnomination. And exnomination is a process of excluding ideas or people from discussion and from the world by simply not naming them, by simply turning your attention somewhere else. So you're not actively saying, don't be X or Z is bad, but you're just not mentioning them. And somehow they're not included. And that's the thing that journalists do. Journalists exnominate in Silicon Valley, for example, the working class. One of the things that we did when we did the Seeing Silicon Valley book was literally try to apply Bell Hooks' oppositional gaze. Let's look where they're telling us not to look. Let's look at the ordinary people in the Valley and how their lives are shaped, and so themselves shape the technologies that are built there. And literally, when we went to publishers, they just literally wouldn't go there with us. It's like, no, we're not going to look at that. We can't look at that. The Valley is this other thing that we already know. It's Tech Bros. It's Burning Man. It's that. It's not the taqueria lady that you photographed. It's not the Facebook security guard. It's something else. So that is another tactic, to get to your point. That's another tactic we can use. We can look where we're told not to look, and we can say what we see. And that's very powerful.
Absolutely. And I think it kind of transitions us into a really interesting conversation to kind of hear all the stuff that you're thinking about. And you talked a little bit about it when you're watching things, but what do you consume on a daily basis to kind of help you keep your awareness, but also keep your sanity. Because all of this, it sounds like it would make you lose your mind a little bit when you're like, they're trying to take our lives. They're trying to take our attention. They're trying to take everything. Well, but how do you keep yourself?
My hair is definitely on fire. What's left of my hair is very much on fire. I am deeply concerned. I'm somebody who studied the 30s and 40s in my book, The Democratic Surround. I've spent a lot of time looking at that. And the similarities between that period and this are shocking and scary and almost hard to name because they are so scary. How do I stay sane? I subscribe to about 8 different newspapers, all the majors.
When you say subscribe, is this digitally or you're not getting a physical?
I get one physical paper. It's an old habit. I get the New York Times every morning, and it's the first thing I consume because I sit down with my breakfast and I have the paper and I'm really foggy and I can just flip through it. But the physical paper also forces me to encounter stories I don't know what to look for. That's really important. Okay, start with the Times. Then across the day, I work through the Washington Post, the Guardian, Fox News, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, a couple of local papers in Maine where my family is, the Portland Press Herald, and the Mount Desert Island. It's the MDI paper, but I don't remember the name of it. I work through those. There are a couple of Substacks I follow, which can be good for specific things. I think that's really the core of my news diet. The other thing I'm careful to do is to surround myself with people who are thoughtful and aren't constantly spamming me with new horrible things happening. And I have a couple of good friends who do try to spam me that way, and I've just talked to them and said, look, don't send me that stuff because it's just too upsetting, right? When Trump does something horrible again, when ICE goes to North Carolina again, those things, I have to limit my exposure to those things. So when really bad stuff is happening, I actually don't turn on the radio except for a half-hour dinner time. I catch the news, I learn it, I put it away because otherwise I would go crazy. And then I guess the other thing I try to do is I try really hard to write and speak and be public about my opposition to what's happening. I think that's really important. I think that a lot of folks in my world kind of had their heads down and I'll just go do my thing, it'll pass. And there's an old joke in Maine where I spend a lot of time that, when the bear comes to the camp, he takes you one at a time. So he eats the first camper, and the other campers are like, oh, phew, he's not going to eat me. Well, then he goes for the next camper. Well, it's still not me. Eventually, the bear eats all the campers. So I'm one of the campers right now saying there's a bear in camp and this is a problem. And that gives me some energy. That gives me some strength.
And so with all of this, fighting back, you must have junk food, something that is a secret pleasure of yours that you go to.
Oh, this is going to get really dark. Yeah. Okay. All right. You're going to out me totally here. Yeah. So I like to watch a lot of midnight YouTube. And midnight YouTube, this is what I watch at midnight. I think I watched everything that Taylor Tomlinson has produced. She's a comedian.
Excellent comedian.
Oh, she's so funny. Jesus, she's funny. Love Taylor Tomlinson. I watch a lot of music videos. I'm currently, and I know I'm not alone in this, I'm completely enamored of a band called Wet Leg, and I'm just watching them all the time. I'm watching Chaise Long on replay. I also watch a lot of old sort of 60s concert videos, and occasionally, if I'm feeling super sentimental, I can actually watch shows at a club called SO36 from Berlin that I was at, where videos were made, and they're now on YouTube. They were filmed and then they were on YouTube. And so I can occasionally do that. And that's just a bizarre, strange time travel experience that I let myself have every now and again.
So how do you palate cleanse when you're going through too much of this?
Mostly I get my body back in action. So much, we talk about this as an intellectual problem, but being able to reason depends on having confidence in your body and your body being in good shape. And so I exercise a lot. I paddle a kayak. I paddle a sea kayak that gets me out on the ocean. And when you're in a sea kayak and the water's bumpy, you are fully engaged with your kayak or you are falling over. And I'm fully engaged with my boat. I also play music. I play banjo. I play bluegrass banjo. So I play with other folks doing that. And that's a really intimate, warm experience that I kind of love. So those are the ways I do it.
Amazing. So I think our takeaways are turn off your screens, learn to play the banjo, go kayaking.
Talk to people.
Talk to people. And get on the streets and protest.
And get on the streets and protest. And especially reach out to people who are different than you and disagree and try to find the common ground and do that over and over and over again. The world will change.
I did have one last burning question for you. You talked about not having to set a boundary with some people about sending you a lot of bad news. Mm-hmm. What would you say to people who have that problem of they're seeing all these terrible things and they just want to give attention to all of it? Is there a problem with that, and maybe how do they handle that?
Yeah. So one of the things that's an illusion, right, is that if you give attention to problems, if you focus on them, if you forward news about them, you've actually done something to solve them. It's simply not the case. You're allowing your attention to be drawn up into these things, and you're involved in what one of my journalist friends calls misery porn often. And you do not want to circulate misery porn. You want to put an end to the thing that causes misery. And to do that often requires hard, dull, in-person work. The reward for doing hard, dull, in-person work, as anyone involved in civil rights in the 60s can tell you, is friendships that last a lifetime, a level of trust with other people that will blow your mind, and the discovery of allies in places you never thought you had them, who will support you, sustain you, and reach out to help you when you need them. And that's an amazing sensation.
Well, I don't think that there's a better term to end the podcast on than misery porn. I think that really wrapped things
I was hoping
up.
when you go to the more uplifting part of my little talk there. You know, thanks for bringing us back to the dark side.
I thought that was just great.
Yeah, it's a good term. It's a good term.
Yeah, it really summarizes it well.
Yeah, it does.
But
Okay.
don't do that. Don't do that, folks.
Well, as much as we've told everyone to turn off their screens and throw their laptops in the river and get in their kayaks, if people do want to find more of you and your insights and they're going to do their screen to do that, where should they go?
I'm super easy. You can just Google up fredturner.stanford.edu or just Fred Turner at Stanford. And I have a website there that has everything I've written linked and has a bunch of videos of me talking and podcasts of me talking. And yeah, you can get all the Fred Turner you ever wanted right there. And let me also just make a pitch too for the Baffler right now. The Texan Ideology on the Baffler is brand new, out about a week ago. You can catch the latest Fred Turner there. That's not on my website, but it's free to everybody. So go check it out.
Fantastic.
Thank you,
so
Fred.
much.
We so appreciate you for coming
Yeah,
on.
thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
This has been another episode of CAPTivated. It's been hosted by CAPT. You know, CAPTivated. You guys get it. It's the Center for American Political History, Media, and Technology.
The ideas presented by individuals on the podcast are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent Purdue University, which adheres to a policy of institutional neutrality.
To learn more about this episode's guest, check out the show notes. We really enjoyed this conversation today, and we hope you got something out of it too. Thanks for listening.